first of all, I want to thank Branko, Brittany, and Iris for organizing all of this. I'm also very flattered and, in a sense, humbled that part of my collection is being shown here at the museum. As I look out over the audience, I see members of the collective circle of longstanding, and I see several new faces. And I just want to take a minute to preface my comments by saying that organizing any kind of an exhibition is a labor-intensive operation. And I want to thank the registrar of this museum, Sarah, for organizing a team of 4 herself, Allison, Ryan, and Andrew. They drove from here to my home up north, and we turned our yoga room in our home into a staging area. And here they condition reported and carefully packed all of the objects. That was a rather labor-intensive operation. And then they transported them all here safely to the museum. Once they got here, it was important to try to figure out how to display them. And for that, I thank Branko, who was working with Desiree. And Desiree very, very graciously worked on providing the texts for the labels and the didactic panels that you see upstairs. So this was an enormous endeavor that took a great deal of time, effort, and people to achieve. And I just want to alert people in the audience that might not be aware of that this just doesn't happen overnight. And if I didn't have that great cooperation, this would have never happened. And the result is a spectacular eye candy display. My objects have never looked this well in my home. And I was hoping that the director would be here because after seeing the exhibition, I want to revisit the loan agreement and contract because I think my objects are worth a lot more than they were when I originally signed those agreements. Be that as it may, the topic of our conversation is Christianity and its roots in Egypt. It's a known fact that Alexandria plays a very, very important role in that development. We start the saga with a so-called letter of Aristeas, an Alexandrian Hellenized Jew writing in the 2nd century before the Common Era. And his letter records an incident that occurred in the 3rd century before the Common Era, during the reign allegedly of Ptolemy II, one of the rulers of the Ptolemaic dynasty. And in this letter, Arius is at pains to say the mandate of the Great Library of Alexandria was to have one copy of every known book in existence in its collection. What was missing from that library was a copy of the Hebrew Torah. So Ptolemy II, in order to fulfill that mandate, commissioned 72 rabbinical scholars, and he put them up, sparing no expense, and asked them to come up with a simultaneous translation in Greek of the Torah, which they did. And the result is known as the Septuagint, named in honor of the 72 rabbinical scholars that did that. And from that moment on, the majority of the Greek-speaking world in the Eastern Mediterranean was aware of the tenets of Judaism. The only fly in the ointment for me, if you're familiar at all with Jewish rabbinical scholars, if you show 2 rabbis one passage from the Torah and ask what it means, they'll give you 10 interpretations. So the credibility that 72 people in a given amount of time can come up and all agree, a little bit strange, but we let that go. Having established the Greek basis of Judaism in the 1st century of the Common Era, a gentleman by the name of Mark visits Alexandria, and he's on the beginning of his first proselytizing mission. And as he's wandering through the streets of Alexandria, his sandal breaks. And so, limping along, carrying a broken sandal, he tries to find a shoemaker and ends up in the cobbler shop of a man named Ananias. And this is a relief showing a Roman cobbler at work. And Mark starts to proselytize Ananias. He's a good teacher, remember, because Mark is the first evangelist, one of the four, but he's the first one to write the gospel in the New Testament. And as Mark is talking to him, he stabs himself with the awl and has a wound. And Mark, because he's miraculous, cures it. And Ananias invites him to his house, and the entire family is converted to Christianity, and those are the first converts. Mark leaves to visit places that he had visited earlier, and when he returns, he finds a thriving Christian community. Once he's there, like all early Christian saints, Mark is martyred. Now, there's two traditions from the church that one follows. Number one claims he was martyred in Rome during the reign of Nero, as was Peter and Paul. But the Alexandrian tradition, and this is what we want to stick on now, said that he was killed when he was celebrating Mass at the same time that the polytheists were celebrating a celebration of one of their deities. And the polytheists were afraid that Mark was going to draw their participants and attention away from the pagan ritual. And so they stormed in and they killed him. And they then decided they were going to burn him. So as they lit the funeral pyre that they were going to put his body on, the heavens miraculously broke open. It rained, the fire went out. The faithful rescued the body of Mark and buried it. Now, tradition says he was buried in one of these caves. This is because Alexandria is on a limestone shelf, and over the years, the Mediterranean Sea gouges out these channels. And so Mark, according to the Alexandrian tradition, was buried in one of these. Now, gets to be crazy. The Greek mission, under the direction of Harry Tsalis, the Hellenic Institute for Ancient and Medieval Alexandrian Studies, a mouthful, starts diving in the area where some of these features are found. And he finds column capitals that relate to Paleo-Christian Corinthian capitals found elsewhere. And he also finds a sigma table. And this is a typical stone cover that lays on top of Christian altars. These are from about maybe the 4th century of the Common Era. But what's important is this is the first archaeological evidence ever found in Alexandria that tests the earliest evidence of the early Christians there. And it's in the exact area where tradition maintains Mark was. And there's a private school called the College of St. Mark's in Alexandria, and it is built on this very neighborhood where Mark was said to have suffered his martyrdom, and where Harry has found his collection of works. And from that, Christianity emerges. But we have to understand Christianity is composed of two component elements. The translation of the Septuagint into Greek enabled the early Christians to understand and incorporate elements of Judaism into their religion in the form of the Old Testament. Now, Judaism is a religion of the book. I don't mean to be facetious here, but if you Google masterpieces of ancient Jewish art, you're not going to find the book. And so these early Christians had to find a visual vocabulary. And that visual vocabulary was based on Greek and Roman images that they were growing up with. And in order to demonstrate that, I juxtaposed the Torah with this enormous tapestry that's in the Abbeck-Stiftung in Switzerland. And I call your attention to the fact that earlier in this very lecture hall, I presented a lecture, Dionysus between Osiris and Christ. And there I discussed the perpetuation of Hellenistic motifs in a Christian context. And thanks to Branco and the museum here, it's online. So if you ever want to refresh your memory and revisit that, feel free to do so. So we have this blending of the tradition, the word from the Hebrew, and married to a visual tradition that comes from the classical world. Now, all of this is to be understood under a phenomenon that historians call the Hellenization of the world. And by that I mean, in the aftermath of Alexander's conquest in the 4th century before the Common Era, Greek was like this tsunami that drowned everybody. And when they emerged, they were all Greek. So Hellenization, number one, it affected the Jewish community in Alexandria, the largest urban Jewish population anywhere in the world at that time. And they were looked down upon by their co-religious in Jerusalem because you don't know how to speak our language anymore. They were completely Greek. The diet in Roman Egypt changes. If you could get an Egyptian from the Middle Kingdom or the New Kingdom and transport him in time, or her, into the Roman Imperial Period, they would not recognize what they were eating. Everything is the menu of what the Greeks and Romans are eating, not what the earlier Egyptians were eating. And then we have this seismic effect. The ancient Egyptian language can be written in 3 notational scripts. The hieroglyphs, which I compare to printing, hieratic, which I compare to longhand or script, and demotic, which I consider, if you take the analogy, shorthand. But there comes a point in Egypt's history in the Roman Imperial Period that we experience the period of illiteracy. Greek becomes so prevalent as the language that the Egyptians can no longer write in any of their 3 scripts. And the script that emerges is called Coptic. And here's where we need to look at the etymology of that particular word. The noun Copt and the adjective Coptic are etymologically derived from the Arabic word al-Gupt. And that in itself is an Arabic abbreviation of the Greek word Aegyptos, the Latin word Aegyptos, that in turn is based on the Egyptian phrase Hut-ka-Ptah, the shrine of the spirit of the god Ptah. That is an abbreviation used in the Roman Imperial Period for the city of Memphis, and it referred to Egypt as a whole. The analogy I use is we say the White House to be the analogy for the United States government of the United States. So the Arabs, when they took over in the 7th century of the Common Era, looked at the people that they were conquering, and they called them, the Egyptians, the Copts, naming them after the word that they used for their country. Now, in the exhibition above, we have a Coptic manuscript from the 19th century. And this is what's really unbelievable about this tsunami of Hellenization. The Egyptians have an era of illiteracy. They can no longer write. Now, we don't know who the geniuses were, but some genius grabs the Greek alphabet. He takes 5 or 6 signs from the now misunderstood Demotic alphabet and creates the Coptic alphabet. So the language of the early Christian polytheists in Egypt that converts is a notational system given to them by the Greeks. Another example of this tidal wave of being swamped. Coptic today in the Egyptian church is like Latin in the Roman Catholic West. And as a result, in the 19th century prayer book, you have glosses because Arabic is the spoken language. So if you were a Copt using this prayer book in a church, in order to be able to follow it, if you didn't know Latin, you'd have a subscription that would help you out. And the development of the Coptic language from Greek has to be understood in terms of the overwhelming impact that Greek language had worldwide. Because not only do we get the Coptic alphabet based on Greek, but the Slavic language in Cyrillic also comes the same way. We have the priests that are making their pilgrimage up the Balkans. The Slavic people at that time are illiterate, and the Greeks modify their language and give them the Cyrillic alphabet. So we cannot underestimate how powerfully impacted the ancient world was because of the presence of the Greeks in the aftermath of the conquest of Alexander the Great. And the second point we have to understand is, as the world merges into Christianity, it is not a sand in the line. I use a light switch as my metaphor here. Just because an edict is passed doesn't mean everybody becomes Christian. Okay? Society doesn't change like a light going on or off. And so we see that even when Christianity becomes an established religion in the empire, polytheists still continue. And in the Parthenon, we wait until the last quarter of the 5th century before the Common Era, before the Parthenon is converted into a church. But remember, that conversion is only interior. If you were a Christian walking up on the Parthenon, the facade, the flanks, the aisles, the sculpture, that's all from my past. And so, yes, I am Christian, but I don't take off my pagan clothes. They're part of who I am. And to show you just how persistent polytheistic feelings ran, we look at the Temple of Dendur, built during the reign of Augustus in the late 1st century before the Common Era. And there's an inscription in Coptic. And if you go and look at the backside of this pier, that's where you will find it. The inscription tells us that the alterations were made during the time of Abraham was the presbyter, and the rituals that were performed were accompanied by the putting of a cross on the top of the temple roof. And this happened in 577, years after the conversion. But look at this. The pagan tradition was so strong that when the presbyter Abraham had to modify the building by cutting a door to enable the Christian rite to flourish, they had to destroy an arm of the figure of Isis. She was amputated. And so strong was the feeling of that pagan goddess that they recut her arm and they masked the amputated stub with a piece of plaster that has since fallen off. So even in 577, the strength of the pagans was still much too strong for the Christians to completely eradicate. And that tradition continues in a group of images that are upstairs from the collection. They date anywhere from the 4th to the 7th and 8th century. They represent dolls, female figures, whatever. They were used to instruct children, maybe about trying to be a woman. They might have also been toys. But the point is that there's a long development. And when you get to here, these are even created during the Islamic period. So despite the change of religion, despite the change of culture, persistent traditions are not eradicatable. And it even goes with the figures of Venus. We have papyri documents that continue into the 4th and 5th century that say brides-to-be in their trousseaus were often provided with a figure of Aphrodite, because the bride was supposed to be as beautiful as the goddess of love, Venus. The bride was supposed to be as fecund, to have children as the goddess Venus. And I'm very happy to say, if you go upstairs and you look at Athens, cradle of democracy, that Branko was just put up there, there are 2 images, photographs of the Venuses. This one on the bottom, this is the so-called Medici Venus. And you can see that 1, 2, 3 are all clones of the famous Aphrodite. So she became an icon, and depending on where you were, you simply copied that same form. And in addition to having classical images, the early Christians grabbed onto pharaonic imagery. And here we have a tombstone, and we know it's Christian because the inscription in Greek says the only God, the helping one, Paul, down here. And we have what may be a dove, and the dove is wearing the Egyptian hieroglyph for Nefer. That translates in Egyptian hieroglyphs as perfect. So we have a dove equipped with a hieroglyph, meaning that he is the perfect soul in heaven. And so we have this combination of taking from my pharaonic heritage, from my Greek heritage, because the bookish tradition of the Hebrews has no visual means for the Christians to be able to express some of their beliefs. And the reason it's inscribed in Greek is because early on, Coptic and Greek were used almost contemporary until after the Arab conquest. And for those that are interested, my Instagram page has a further discussion of that particular stele if you want to follow it. That brings us to this amazing situation. Pagan practices continue. The Italian colleagues in Turin, in Middle Egypt, have uncovered a whole range of terracotta figurines in a demonstrably Christian domestic context. And almost every one of the figures is broken. And if you see, of these 2, you can grab the head, and you pop it. The question is, what's going on here? One suggestion is, pregnant Christian women went to a sanctuary in order to acquire a figure that might ensure a successful pregnancy, because infant mortality and women dying was very rampant in the ancient world. And so when they went home and the delivery was successful, I didn't need the magic anymore, so I could pop the head and discard it. But that breaking is a ritual, a performance ritual that goes back to pharaonic Egyptian times. And remember, there are conspiracy theorists amongst us Egyptologists. And the conspiracy theorist says, wait a minute. Maybe the magic didn't work and the mother miscarried or died. In which case, boom, in a fit of pique, I broke it because it didn't work. So we always have to remember there's an alternative interpretation that may obtain. But the practices continue because in Egypt, when the Nile River flowed in ancient times, individuals would collect Nile water in a flask like this, and they would bring it home because they were hoping that the prosperity that the Nile River would bring to the land would also transfer to their household, to their personal home. And in the Christian period, adopting the same shape, like a World War I canteen, there's a story about a Christian saint whose name is Minos. And Minos is serving in the Roman army in Phrygia, in Turkey. And during the reign of Diocletian in 297, Common Era, Minos declares himself a Christian, and because it's the time of the great persecution by Diocletian, he's killed. The followers of Minos pick him up, put him on a camel, and bring the body to Egypt. And as it proceeds south of Alexandria, the two camels that are carrying him and his possessions sit on the ground and refuse to move. And the people accompanying Minos say, this is a sign. This is where we have to build the shrine. And they built a shrine to St. Minos, now a UNESCO heritage site. It is huge, sprawling. Here's the little dot on the map to show you where it actually is, south of Alexandria. You can see the modern church to Minos. Here it is in the distance. It's huge. It drew pilgrims in antiquity from as far away as Ireland. And they came here because they wanted to collect either holy oil that the priest had blessed or water from a sacred spring that was close to the church, so they could carry it home in a jar like this in order to receive the benefactions of Minos. And it's exactly the same transference of grabbing Nile water in a bottle, bringing it home. And what they did is they just changed the person, and they may have changed the substance. So Egypt is very instructive because a lot of Christian practices are derived directly from pharaonic antecedents. And then we have this incredible, difficult period of the 4th century, which I think is one of the most amazing 100-year period in the ancient world to be able to study. And what we see is a series of edicts, first passed by Constantine in Milan 313, which does not make Christianity the religion of the empire. It simply says every subject of the empire can worship according to their conscience. So the edict removes the stigma of being a Christian. And we see a series of edicts through the 4th century, ending up with Theodosius, who is, pardon me, he's a little bit ballistic here, okay? He passes edict after edict after edict against the polytheists. And it gets to be, no matter how many he passes, they're still broken. So in 391, he passes what is the most horrific edict against the polytheists. And he still finds people violating it. So in 392, he issues yet another one in which he declares, if you break any of these rules, you are sinning against me, you're sinning against the church, and you will pay dearly for it. And what makes the Edict of 392 so frightening is paganism virtually ceases. The edict was more threatening than Diocletian's threat of torturing you if you were a Christian. And as we've seen, even that threat of severe punishment did not faze the Christians, because we saw the pagans, because we saw in the Parthenon and we saw at the Temple of Dendor that they continued to limp on. He could not eradicate all of it at once. And that brings us now to this problem. In trying to collect Christian art from Egypt, one of the most plentiful artifacts are textiles. And the reason for that is because the Christians in Egypt continue to bury their dead, not mummified so much, but wrapping them in whatever kind of cloth. It could be a drape, it can be a tablecloth, it could be a rag, it could be a shmata, you name it, I'll wrap it around the dead body. And as people found these bodies and they removed the cloth, they saved the more interesting patterns that were there. And individuals said, it's been found on a Christian body in a Christian context, so everything must have a Christian interpretation. So people strove to look at an image like this and said, well, It's a warrior. I mean, he's got a shield, he has a spear, and what looks on the top of their head must be halos. So these must be Christian warriors. Are they? And the question is raised because in 1964, there was the first international exhibition devoted to Christianity on the Nile. And Coptic art came into its own. And all of a sudden, everything was Christian. And we at the Brooklyn Museum bought this relief. And we justified it by saying, it's a biblical theme. This is an acanthus plant. In Roman iconography, the acanthus is the symbol of resurrection. We got 3 busts on the top. Well, it's got to be the 3 kids in the fiery furnace. Well, simple. And my colleague working at the Dunbar Notes at the time wanted to see our collection. And I invited him to come to Brooklyn. And this was on the wall in the great court in the 3rd floor of the Brooklyn Museum. And when I went down to pick him up from the information desk, we stopped in front of it. And I said, what do you think of it? He said, so as he's doing this dance, I said, it's fake, isn't it? He said, yeah. So why is it on view? Every one of my department has to pass this wall at least once a day. Coming to the museum, leaving the museum, navigating the museum, going to the toilet. And it's there to show we are all fallible. We all make mistakes. And so when I look at collectors and museum curators worldwide, and they say, I never bought a fake. I look at them in the eye and say, you're lying through your teeth. And then, right around this time of year, as Branko alluded, a very, very famous family of collectors in Manhattan was featured in Life magazine in a photo spread. And they had a Coptic relief that was identified as rest on the flight into Egypt. How appropriate is that for Christmas? And we borrowed it at the Brooklyn Museum. And then my colleagues started to look at it and say, there's something Italianate about this. Italianate? Yeah. Kind of like, looks like something you might see in Giotto or Duccio. Okay. We did a little bit of scraping, and the Egyptian government hired an Italian multinational corporation to do some building in Egypt. And with that hiring was a group of stonemasons, Italian stonemasons. And they had nothing to do with their downtime. So limestone is plentiful in Egypt. You can carve it with a butter knife. And so these guys started to crank these out. By the time, the market is flooded with this. And if you look, what's so difficult about that? You give everybody a round head. You give everybody bagel eyes. You give everybody spiky hair. And whoa, you make a Christian theme. It's Christian. It's Coptic. I'll buy it. And we finally acquired this from the owner. But we had a policy in Brooklyn in those days. If it's a fake, but it has to be a very, very good fake, we will pay you as much as $500 for it. And that's what we gave the owners of this particular relief. So that when we look at objects that ceramicists like these vases tell us, they were made during the period that we understand is the Christian period. Are we permitted to say that every image is Christian? So that when we look at the vase here with this bird and these florals, are we justified in saying, yeah, that's the dove of the Spirit in Christian paradise? Or when we look at this vase, is this the same interpretation of the dove in paradise because of the foliage, with a Christian in the Oran position because he's in heaven? We have to remember that the pagans continued, and these were made during a time when both Christians and polytheists were alive and living together. So before anybody bets the mortgage that this thing is absolutely Christian, please understand that if there's not corroborating evidence, you won't be able to tell. When you get to a vase like this, the situation changes. Because here we see a horned altar, we see a cross that's nimmed, we see the reticulated pattern, which may be nets, and we see a fish that's being hauled in. And the combination of the fish, the nimmed cross, reminds one of the anagram for Christ, Jesus Christos Theos Soter, Jesus Christ, God's Son, the Savior. The fish became the quintessential Christian symbol. And so when you see it here in association with a cross, chances are pretty good that this was made for a Christian. And we see the monogram on a graffiti in the temple of in Ephesus on one of the walls. And then we have this interesting situation. In that same 4th century, when Christianity is gaining the ascent, the polytheists in Egypt still worship deities in the form of animals. They never abandon them. And so we have this stele in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo that represents a sacred bull. The bull is called the Bucus. The Bucus was a hypostasis or alternate form of the god Mantu, the god of war. And we can date it because here is Constantius II's cartouche, and here in hieroglyphs is the date of the stele, which translates into our language as the 4th of November. And when you look at this carefully, the image of the bull has been doctored, in which we have a variation of the monograph, Jesus Christ, Son of God, and a cross, so that some point after 340, the Christians got a hold of this and they tried to exorcise it by putting the monogram and the cross to nullify the power that this might have had for the pagan community. And then Christianity is riddled with jockeying for position. And we have an interesting situation, and Branko and I discussed this, so I'm trying to keep this simple for all of us. The Council of Chalcedon is convened by Emperor Marcan, and it's a month-long meeting from October to November in 451. And I have it's so famous in the church that it's even commemorated in frescoes with Marcan in the middle. And the council is convened because the Christians are now confused about what the nature of Christ is. And the confusion stems from the fact that there's a contradiction or an apparent contradiction. If Christ is immortal, how does he die? Because by definition, immortality does not perish. And so think about Hellenization, swiping everybody. Aristotelian categorization does not allow Christ to be one. He's got to be mortal, but then when he is crucified, and he has to be divine when he performs the miracles. So he has to have two natures. Those people that are not drowning in Greek philosophy, whoa. We have a god, Osiris. He's divine. He died. He was resurrected. He's still divine. And so the Greek-speaking part of that organization decide that we have to decide this issue. And so it took them a month to debate this back and forth. And what's interesting about it in the church is this Hellenization, and I thank Branko again for Athens' home democracy, the issue was decided by each bishop having one vote. And they put the vote on the floor. Does this guy have two natures or does he have one? And they voted. Very democratic. Another example of the Hellenization of the Christian church. And they decided that he is a diophysite. He has two natures, a divine and a mortal in one. And the dissenting view of the Coptic church says he has one nature, the monophysite. And what makes this so amazing is that Egypt is a province of the Byzantine Empire. And so what you have is an administration of minority individuals that are diophysite Christians responsible to Byzantium, ruling over an enormous population that is monophysite. So you have this strange kind of coexistence between two sects. And earlier, before the lecture started, there was a question here about what they're wearing. And if you look at Eastern Orthodox priests today, they are wearing the most gorgeous habits you could possibly imagine. And if you look at contemporary Coptic priests in Egypt today, they're all in black. And that's significant because the regalia of the Greek Orthodox priest is a symbol that they belong to the church of the emperor. And the black of the Coptic priests indicates that we are not visually one of you. Again, the swamping of the tradition. And then we get this very, very strange situation where the rulers and a minority of the church fathers are Byzantine, and the entire population is Coptic. And we revert now to papyri documentation in the 600s of the Common Era. And we look at the papyri that were found southeast, southwest of Cairo in a place called Nakhun. And here you have the monastery of the Archangel Gabriel at Nakhun. And here's what the papyri tell us. This monastery is manned by prelates that are aligned with the Byzantine Empire. And the papyri record how a Coptic priest, a monophysite, just happens to visit the monastery. Now, you've got a difference of sect here, right? You read the papyri, and yes, the Coptic priest is welcomed. They feed him, they take care of him. But when you read between the lines, the Coptic priest is a second-class citizen. You know that because they're trying to distance him from the diophysites that are running the monastery. And then the Arab invasion comes, 642 of the Common Era. And I show you wishful thinking on the part of the Byzantines, because this is a 13th century manuscript, and it shows the Byzantine army chasing the Muslim army. But that didn't happen. I mean, they lost. Wishful thinking. But it serves to illustrate that there's a change in government, a change in religion in 642. And the papyri stop. There are no more dated papyri during that period. Within a decade, the papyri documents start to come out. And these papyri documents are dated. So we're pretty sure we know what's happening. And what's happening? That Coptic priest and his friends, who were second-class citizens, now go back and they occupy that monastery. And we cannot find a trace of any Greek Byzantine priest anywhere in Egypt. They all vanished. And with the Arab conquest, Coptic Christianity becomes the religion of the Christians in Egypt. And at the beginning, they are tolerated by their Muslim overlords. And the Christian Coptic church is alive and well today in Egypt. We have in the exhibition upstairs some ceilings, one with an angel, one with a monogram, and a little one with a cross that you see there. And these are still being used by Coptic monks in Coptic monasteries as corks to seal earthen containers for wine, water, grain, whatever. So the tradition continues, and the Copts still make up a significant percentage, sometimes 10% of the population, according to some estimates. So when you think of early Christianity and you want to visit churches, if that interests you, you can go to Italy, you can go to Palermo and visit the Norman monument, you can go to Cefalù, you can go to Venice and visit St. Mark, you can go to the islands to the north, you can go to Greece, but you can also go to Egypt. Because in Egypt, we have this breathtaking monasteries that are still active, such as the Red Monastery at Soham, a sprawling complex, still active. You can see the dome hidden by the heights, and there's a cutaway view, and the inside is gloriously decorated with medieval frescoes that rival just about anything that you can see from the Byzantine world. And I think that it's well worth remembering that if you're interested in medieval art like this, the place to go is Egypt, because monuments like this are not found anywhere else in the world. And it's for that reason that we are planning a mini documentary series, the title of which is The Intellectual Legacy of Ancient Alexandria. And part of that legacy is the Christian episode that I've reviewed with you here today. And we're hoping that we can bring this to your television home plasma TV screen. And we have an episode where I'm actually walking through 5th century Common Era Christian buildings in order to make this story a lot more entertaining and a lot more visually attractive. I thank you all for your attention and want to turn the question over to Branko.